Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Sally Jensen. 2024 is set to be a massive year for elections around the world, and just like elsewhere, Taiwan's political parties are grappling with this idea of the youth vote. Candidates are trying to find ways to win over the younger generation through focusing on issues they consider important, outreach, and internet memes. But with Taiwan facing an aging population, how much about young people is the narrative getting wrong? To discuss these issues, we're joined today by Wei-Ting. She's a political economist at Franklin and Marshall College who focuses on governance in Asia. Wei-Ting, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's zoom out on young people. Who exactly are Taiwan's young voters? Is there like an average archetype? How homogeneous are they really?
So I would say Taiwanese young voters are just like young voters everywhere in the world. They are not homogeneous. They are just like different age groups. They have different preference. There is one thing I would say that Taiwanese young voters that are more of the same compared to other age generations in Taiwan. They tend to have high similarities in terms of identity. So there's not an identity issue for Taiwanese young voters, which is more of like an issue for older generations. But other than that, I would say they're like any other age groups that have different opinions on different issues.
Can you tell us a bit more about this identity? You say that they have less of an identity problem than the older generation, and maybe talk about that difference a little bit.
So for the older generations, so there are two major issues dominating Taiwan politics, and both are related to China. So one question is whether you are Taiwanese or Chinese. So for older generations, there tend to be a split between people who identify solely as Taiwanese or versus people who identify as Chinese/Taiwanese. But for younger voters, especially people who are aged between 20 to 29, they grew up, they were born after 1993, or so that was almost as old as Taiwan's democracy. So they grew up in a democratic setting. So a lot of them don't feel like they are Chinese. So naturally, more than 80% of them identify themselves as Taiwanese with no problem. So that's what I mean. Identity is an issue. What Taiwan should do with China, like attitude toward China, whether it's to be maintaining the status quo or be more pro-independence or even be more pro-unification, that is the second question. And on that question, I would say that there is a portion of young voters who are also pro-independence, but I think the majority of the young voters are still more pro-status quo.
And how is China still a big issue on many people's minds?
Yes, I would say so. I would say the China factor is still a big issue, even in this election. If one good example will be if you look at the presidential debate and the vice presidential debate that just happened, you would notice that the China issue, the cross-strait issue, was still a dominating issue in both debates. That being said, I want to point out that the three candidates actually have not been very clear in how they're different. They actually, in the most of their electoral campaign, they try to, on cross-strait issue, they try to make themselves as similar as the other group, which is to maintain the status quo. The difference is just what their methods to achieve the status quo. And so young people may actually view the elections and think that all three candidates are not that different in terms of their cross-strait relations. If you watch the debates, you would know they are very different. But the problem is young voters, they may not get political information from traditional media outlets like TV or like presidential debates. They may be getting their information from TikTok or from Instagram or from Little Red Book that tend to feature, short real videos. So to summarize, even though China factor is an important issue determining Taiwan's election, whether young voters perceive the difference between the three candidates or not, I think that is a different question.
So before we zoom in on how much each political party and each candidate is reaching out to younger voters, let's take a look at how this political engagement, how politically educated are young people?
Young people tend to have more uh, channels to receive their information, and that is definitely more diverse than previous electoral cycles and than older generations. Hence, they're also subject to higher probability of information campaign for sure. So it requires them to actually be more literate. Like they need to be more politically literate to be able to discern the accuracy of information. So it's the task is actually it's actually harder for them to do so. And I want to mention one thing. I think it's important why all three candidates are trying to cater to young voters. My own research does show that people with experiencing higher economic insecurity, they tend to be expressing more populist attitude or more anti-establishment attitude. And young people, because they tend to be the group with the lower wages, they're subject to higher probability of feeling economic insecurity. And so I think for an opposition party, they all try to capture, harness that share of voters as their potential voter base.
Okay, now let's zoom in on how each of the candidates is trying to court younger voters. So we'll start with Ko Wen-je. He's thought to be the most appealing to the youth. Do you think this is true?
I think it's true. It's definitely true. And because one of the reasons I think is because he is very effective in communication. He's very good at public speaking that can appeal to young voters for sure. So a typical profile that would support Ko Wen-je would be voters who are 20 to 29 with college education, especially male. So male college educated young voters tend to be Ko Wen-je's core supporter base.
This has attracted some criticism, of course, this particularly that he's only appealing to the kind of younger, maybe more online male contingent. What do you make of those criticisms?
So Ko Wen-je is a candidate that if you sometimes will say things without thinking too much. If you give him a platform, sometimes he would say things that are sexist and reveal like he is has a very paternal, male dominating thinking in his head. And so I think it is not a surprising fact that he has a harder time attracting female voters.
Now let's talk about Lai. Do you think his campaign is out of touch, perhaps, with concerns about the cost of living and minimum wage?
I think for all the three candidates, including Lai, they all are aware of the domestic issue, and the most important domestic issue is the high housing price, low wage issues. So they all try to find different ways to, cope with that. They'll have different types of housing policy or ways to increase wages, especially for young people. Like Qingde's baggage is that the DPP has been in office for 8 years. And so for the DPP candidates, they have to defend for themselves with regard to why they didn't achieve what they aim to achieve in the next 8 years. So if they are campaigning on those issues and they think those issues are important, why didn't they already do that or achieve those goals in the past 8 years that the voters have gave them?
He and his running mate, Kim Xiao, are seen to have a very slick internet presence, PR. Do you think this is enough to win over younger voters?
I think at this moment, voters have decided on who they're going to vote for. So any public campaign right now is going to consolidate their voter base. They're not probably not going to extend their voter base too much. The key issue right now with all the campaign is to try to mobilize their voters to really come out and vote. And I think on the election day, it is still the voter turnout that is going to have an impact on who might win in the end, or how big the margin would be in the end.
What is this turnout, the electoral turnout, like at the moment? How do you think it's going to play out?
For example, Ko-Wen-je has a high popularity among young voters, but a valid question has been whether those high support rate would be translating into, real vote share, because we do know that younger voters, they may show higher support, but on election day, they tend to not come out and vote. And so in that case, your support does not translate into a vote, and then it means nothing. And so that's what I mean when I say voter turnout is very important, because at this moment, I think people have their preferred candidates. So the key issue is whether they go out and cast that vote or not on that day. And last election, we had a voter turnout almost 75%. I'm anticipating a lower voter turnout this year, probably around 70, I would say 70 to 72%, probably.
And finally, let's take a look at Hou Youyi of the opposition Kuomintang. How do you think he is trying to appeal to Taiwan's younger voters?
Their main policy right now is helping young people to pay their down payment for their first house. I think in terms of political campaign, or like the policy each of the candidates propose, they are all not that different from each other. It's all about helping them with interest rate, with the mortgage, and then trying to build more public housing. Whether voters feel that that's enough, I think it's a different question.
And with this, changing landscape of youth voters, talk about economic insecurity there. What do you think, regardless of the outcome of this vote, what do you think is going to become of youth voters in the next 10 or even 20 years?
So it's hard to say because 10 years ago, the sunflower movement kind of, was a generational thing. It defines the trajectory of the sunflower generation. When Taiwan democratized back in 1990, there was also another student movement that kind of shaped that whole generation. So whether the direction the youth voter will go in 10 or 20 years from now, I feel like it's too hard to predict. And if there is a major social movement that, erupt in the future, that may be becoming a determining, factor shaping the whole generation.
Thank you so much, Wei-Ting. It's been really great to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus by following us on social media. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On TaiwanPlus.